little word on like the good people who offered us their platform. So I'm talking about the Internet Freedom Foundation. So the Internet Freedom Foundation is an Indian digital liberties non-profit organization that seeks to ensure technology respects fundamental rights. IFF works on some of the most important issues, like facing internet in India. So issues of internet shutdowns, privacy, surveillance, net neutrality. They sort of work to bring about institutional change and engage with courts, government bodies, and the parliament on these issues. Check out their work at internetfreedom.in. They have some excellent resources to work on. Have some engage in here on the website. Don't forget to sort of click on the donate button. As the work that the IFF does, it's funded completely by ordinary Indian citizens like us. Yeah. So donate to keep your internet free. And like with that message, I will just, I think we will start off today's topic, which is online CSAM. So that's online child sexual abuse material. It's also known as child pornography, though we don't use that terminology now. It's because that is the kind of content which is of a child being abused. So that's why the terminology child sexual abuse material. So when we start, I would like to take you to a time and space far, far ago, which is January 2020. Okay, it was still a very bad time because it was still 2020, but it was bad in a completely different way. So that time we had a civil movement against the Citizenship Amendment Act. So we were all on the streets, we were protesting for our rights, and suddenly, we saw a deployment of a lot of surveillance. So it was not uncommon to lift sort of your newspaper and then see on the front page, headlines saying, is online is freedom of speech under threat? Is your privacy under threat, right? And then like something happened parallelly. So, like around the same time, there was a petition that was floated largely in the child rights sector, which is where some of us work, where it was a petition that was asking organizations who worked in the sector to sort of sign on to a petition to sort of end encryption. Okay. And the same newspapers that were carrying sort of like encrypt your devices, encrypt your face, in the front page were carrying like, let's end encryption on the second page, and both these articles made sense, So each one is like a small, insular, lovely island, and they're both making great points. But the thing is that in complete contradiction with each other, and they don't talk to each other, right? So I think what we are trying to do here is build a bridge between these sort of two insular. So it's not a comfortable issue if you feel, but listening to some of it, it is not valid, right? Because this is a contentious issue, like because we're talking about the safety of vulnerable sort of individuals on the internet, and we are also talking about the privacy of vulnerable individuals on the internet, and they may be vulnerable in their own way. So without further ado, so that is the setting for today. I'll just quickly introduce our speakers. So we have with us Vishaka Datta, who is @BusyDot on Twitter. So she works on gender and sexuality in digital spaces. She runs a non-profit Point of View in Mumbai and is part of the Wikipedia family. Welcome, Vishaka.
Thanks.
Yeah, hi. And then we have Jeremy Malcolm. So Jeremy Malcolm is @QIRTAIBA on Twitter. He is the executive director of the Prostasia Foundation, which is a child protection non-profit. He's got a background in law. Prior to working with Prostasia, he was a senior global policy analyst at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. He worked on the international dimensions of issues such as intellectual property, intermediary liability, net neutrality, governance, etc. Welcome, Jeremy.
Hello.
Then we have Amitabh, who is @Amy from India on Twitter. He is the founder of Social Media Matters. He has been working for nearly 15 years in the development sector. His background is in microsystem techniques, but his inclination is to use social media for activism, for gender rights. He works on online safety and gender sensitization, digital campaigning, and works with stakeholders all across the country. Welcome, Amitabh. Yeah, and then joining Vishaka, Jeremy, and Amitabh is my colleague Uma, who works at Aram India. She has a background in social work and has spent the last 12 years working with children at risk. So at Adam, she works with victims and systems on the issue of child protection from sexual offences. Yeah, we will get to the question. I've already sort of set the like the scene here. So again, just to reiterate, there are several child protection experts who claim that end-to-end encryption on apps like WhatsApp and Telegram, they give safe haven to those who traffic in online child sexual abuse material. And on the other hand, you have digital rights and human rights experts who claim that weakening encryption will result in increased and invasive surveillance. So that's pretty much the debate for today. And I would like to know where you stand on this issue. And like what is the logic behind the positions that you've taken? And Vishaka, if I can start with you.
Sure. So, I work actually more on women's rights, sexual rights, and digital rights, that intersection, not directly on child rights. And I think for us at Point of View, we are very clear that we would not support a demand to remove encryption, right? So for us, if we very, very simply, again, the same demand comes up in the context of online violence, where women are concerned, right? And that's an issue we work on as well. But I think there's lots and lots of reasons why people are asking for encryption to be removed. And of course, it would be wonderful for governments if encryption were removed. But we honestly feel that our overall privacy and security in digital spaces depends on very strong encryption standards, and that we have to think of that as a given. That's not up for grabs, right? Just like the way we might think, for example, of our houses having like doors and locks, etc., some sort of system, that's not up for grabs. Tomorrow we can't say that, hey, you know what, lots of doors in Mumbai, where I live, have suddenly started catching fire, so let's get rid of doors. We can't say that, child sexual abuse offline happens behind closed doors in homes. We can't say stop locking these homes in a sense. So what I'm trying to say is that these are much bigger overall things that we need to keep in place in digital spaces.
Thank you, Vishaka. And Jeremy, I'd like to come to you. So, in the US currently, there is a huge movement around the Earn It bill. So if you can shed some light on that and how this debate features in your sort of in the ecosystem that you work in.
Sure. Well, the Earn It bill is a law that would place extra responsibility on internet companies to solve this problem of online child exploitation. And we, unfortunately, though, the problem is not narrow enough that internet companies can solve it. Child sexual abuse is a broader social problem, and we need to have a broader range of interventions to be able to address it. All that internet companies can do is they can increase surveillance and they can increase censorship. And neither of those things is actually good for child protection, because children's privacy depends, children's safety and privacy depends on having a secure, safe internet. And encryption is actually fundamental for that. We would regard encryption as a basic feature of a safe internet for everyone. In the same way that having safe roads are important, despite the fact that criminals also use roads, the problem is not the roads. The problem is not the encryption. And if we ban encryption, or if the Earn It Act pushes companies into a position where they no longer offer encryption, that's not going to stop criminals. The criminals will just move to other apps. It's only going to hurt people who don't want to break the law. And so we believe that limiting access to encryption is the wrong approach, and that it's doomed to fail in actually protecting children from abuse. Instead, we favor broader interventions that actually help to prevent people going down the path of criminal behavior in the first place.
Thank you, Jeremy. And now I'd like to bring Amitabh in on this question.
Yeah, echoing what Vishakha said and Jeremy said. And Jeremy said something very interesting that was there is a big discussion on a bill. And I was just wondering when was the last time we had a big discussion on any law which was about to change in India. So I'll come back to that. But as said by both the panelists, child safety and then relating to that child's sexually abused material, these are problems of platforms. Only 30% of India is on the internet. The other 70% of children are not safer. And removal of encryption, is it really thought for the criminals and the terrorists as it is told to us? Or is it used for the activists and the journalists, what we see in the practice? So encryption is extremely important and completely support it. Secondly, yes, for safety, somewhere surveillance and security does come in. It is a part of safety. It has been in the offline world and it will be in the online world as well. I guess the larger problem is the lack of faith in state, because there are multiple examples of state misusing this information, or for that matter of fact, platforms misusing this information. We are in a place where awareness around privacy is increasing, awareness around safety is increasing, and that will lead to, being a very, very optimist person, I believe we will create better laws which can be implemented, especially in India. If we go to the court, where I spend time on these cases, everybody from the judge to the criminal will tell you that the law is so impractical it can never be implemented. There are many laws and many sections which haven't seen a conviction in 20-25 years. So we need to start looking towards the cause rather than the case. The media always talks about one case, boys' locker room, and everybody is talking about child safety. And the second the cycle runs out at 23 hours, it is completely forgotten. So let's look into systems. That is what my focus would be, and completely support what the other said.
Uma, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Uma, so
I have an unstable connection, so sorry about that. Yeah. Yeah, so I think I resonate everything that my co-panelists have said, and I think in child rights, you're made to believe that it's either safety or privacy, and both cannot go hand in hand. And I think it's not a trade-off. The question is not whether it can coexist. I think as child rights activists, we need to believe that it must coexist. And actually, ARM was one of the initiatives which openly sort of came out and said that we cannot sort of take this approach of end-to-end encryption because it's going to keep our children safe. And also, like, when you look at privacy as a right, it's not, privacy as my fundamental right should not be based on where I am in my socioeconomic ladder. It's not directly proportional to whether I can afford privacy or not, like how Vishakha said. So what does weakening privacy really mean? It really means that it's going to be unaffordable for a few. And it can be bought only by those who have the means to buy it, because the rich are always going to have a private and a safe experience, right? So it's your classic example of whether I can afford a bungalow or a small kholi in Bombay. And you're basically saying that people who can afford a kholi are not entitled to privacy. So people in positions of power will avail of encryption. So who it really will affect is people who are already affected, and children are one of those most vulnerable populations that we are seeing. So it is going to take away from our children, our women, our young people, and actually it can make them more vulnerable, as somebody said on the panel. If we do away with end-to-end encryption.
Okay, thank you, Uma. I think that covers I think the opening sort of question covered a lot of ground there with, when we are tackling encryption, are we actually going after the issue? Are we going after a symptom of the issue? And when we are talking about ending encryption, we are talking essentially about restriction and encryption to removing encryption as a right for everyone, and then sort of restricting it to a few that can afford it, because we definitely know that that there will for some people they'll always sort of operate in an encrypted environment. So I think look at it from the side that is saying end encryption, right? So the argument behind it is that if cases are not being prosecuted, right, if like the people who are committing, who are sort of producing CSAM, who are leaking it online, the people who are sort of causing this issue there is no prosecution, there are no strong laws. If the police is not able to sort of, trace the content and go after the criminals, and if they are not put behind bars, then where is the message going into society? So essentially, like how are you dealing with it? And the people who are sort of committing these crimes, they are getting away scot-free, right? So what do you think about, so what is, this is a strategy, right? And what is your opinion of this strategy? And in case you don't agree with it, what are the alternatives that you would suggest? Jeremy, would you like to go into this one?
Sure. Well, prosecution of offenders is important, but we know that it's not very effective at preventing new cases of abuse. It's a fighting fires approach. So it waits for abuse to happen and then responds. And that, of course, is harmful to children because by that time they've already been hurt. A better response is to stop abuse from occurring in the first place. And so child sexual abuse prevention experts take a public health approach to the problem. And a public health approach has three types of prevention. Firstly, primary prevention, secondary prevention, and tertiary prevention. Primary prevention is where you target the entire community with initiatives such as comprehensive sex education and also addressing the social problems that are risk factors for child sexual abuse. Then secondary prevention is early intervention targeted at those who are in need of support. For example, people who are seeking help for problematic sexual thoughts or behaviors. And then tertiary prevention means targeting those who have offended in the past to promote their rehabilitation and safe reintegration into society. So the combination of primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention can help to address the root causes of child sexual abuse rather than just fighting fires after children have already been harmed. So I think we need to combine prosecution of offenders with a very robust prevention approach.
So Amitav, in your experience now, the approach that Jeremy has sort of described, why do you think, what are the challenges you see in the sort of the Indian setup, against going for something like this?
I mean, Jeremy has given a really good umbrella look to it, and it's a really broad picture. Being from the field and a practitioner who works closely with tech firms as well as the police, number one, from the police side, at the policing side of it, we need to pump in a lot of resources to have cyber teams marked to really go for these offenders. It's not an easy job. Cyber forensics is still very expensive, and there is a lot of international coordination which is required. That is a sort of a structural issue which we would have to overcome, and we are overcoming. Number two, which I see, is the business side of it. CSAM is a lot of money for a lot of people. Sadly, the revenue or the fines that you have to pay for it are targeting people who are least in place to pay these fines. They are the actual offenders. Platforms, the servers, which are making millions out of this. We don't look into the business side of it. If after the ISP and the larger platforms and the servers which are hosting this content and actually put like Europe has done on content of terrorism, or Japan and New Zealand have done, these financial fines will lead to a major deterrent because there is a lot of technology present which can fight CSAM. DNA and video DNA is very advanced, sadly not used at scale because expensive technology, many people don't have it. But I would like to get the industry behind it in a much stronger manner. They have hackathons to create software to prevent CSAM from happening. But I do see a much larger role of these billionaire tech companies taking a much stronger stand against it. Right now in India, it's the Intermediate Liability Act, which kind of puts the hands off. There was a major social media platform that had a huge child porn, abuse, sexual abuse material content on it. The case went on for about 3 months, and then they said, well, we are employing 500 people, sorry about this. So that cannot be the attitude towards one of the most heinous crimes on the planet. We have to take it much more seriously than we do in India. And a lot of it also has to do with how do you talk about it. Even if you search for a few terms, you might be seen as a predator. So firstly, working it from the field side is highly complex because of the international laws around it. Number two, coming back to the point of laws and hurting the business of CSAM is something which I see happening globally, and would encourage policymakers to go in that direction.
So come back to the liability, that's what platform. But Vishaka, like in your experience, like what are the challenges in pursuing this sort of the public health sort of manner? Because I find for example, there is a disconnect between personal safety and online safety. And online safety is almost like like you just put it simply almost like sexless, gender neutral, or gender exclusive. So what are the challenges you see in pursuing this sort of public health, pursuing this issue in like a public health framework?
Okay, I couldn't hear you very clearly, so I hope I've sort of got the question. But just following up with what both Jeremy and Amitabh were saying, I think one of the real challenges, regardless of, one is I want to really suggest more and more for all forms of abuse that we really start thinking of both the online and the offline, right? Because we are seeing it even with, say, violence against women. It's so interwoven, right? Like it's such a yin-yang type of experience. And the impact ultimately is on the human being, right? So I want to actually say that I think we really need to start looking at it more holistically and looking at the sort of intersection, the continuum, the arcs, etc. I think the one thing that we tend to miss out on when we think about sort of broader approaches, whether online or offline, is really looking at it from the child's point of view. And here's what I want to say. I know a lot of people who themselves have been sexually abused when they were children, and they never spoke out about it, right? Because the barrier to speaking out in the family is too high, right? Online, of course, a lot of the child sexual abuse is not necessarily through family members, etc. But again, I think what we are finding with a lot of teenagers is the inability to distinguish between an interaction online, which may lead to, for example, trafficking, which is also a kind of a component of child sexual abuse, or which is a legitimate form of romance, right? So we are seeing, for example, last year in Calcutta, we came across a case where there was two 16-year-olds. They were in a romantic relationship, and a lot of it had happened through cell phones. So I also want to say, let's think about sort of not just the online, but also the digital, right? And eventually he asked her to go with him to Delhi. And it was sort of supposed to be this elope, that they're going to elope together, etc. But when she got to Delhi, she found that he was trying to traffic her. So then we found out later that in that community, there were many such cases where girls were not able to distinguish between what was romance and what was predation, right? And we see the same online as well. There have been cases, again, with families I know, where a young woman has been groomed by a predator. And there's a case in the US that happened to friends of mine, where the young woman was actually, the FBI got involved, etc., right? And they cracked down pretty heavily. And she insisted, even when this person had been arrested, she said, no, you don't understand. This is a romantic sort of situation. So what I want to say is that I think if you look at it from the perspectives of young people who are being sexually abused online or offline, is there a way we can think of prevention from that lens? And I don't know what the answer is, but surely finding a way for them to speak out safely online and offline, right? Taking some of the shame around sexual violation away from the person who's experiencing it. And I really think, like, some sort of like on education about sort of the difference between like online exploration and online harms, because it's a porous border.
Thank you, Vishaka. Omar, do you want to sort of chime in about the sort of like, the focus on prosecution?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest issues for us is going to be understanding who are the criminals under the law, right? Because even when you're talking about browsing or viewing it is a crime in India, right? And you would be surprised to know that last year we did police training of people working in cyber cells across 8 states. And in the middle of the training, many police personnel working in the cyber cells did not know that viewing child pornography, as they call it, or child sexual abuse imagery, is a crime, right? They actually asked us, what is the harm in doing so if somebody is passively consuming material, right? And also, what about bystanders who are part of, let's say, WhatsApp groups, and things get posted in those groups. So are we going to prosecute the bystanders as well? The other issue is the whole issue of self-generated imagery, right? So even IWF data says that 1/3 of the imagery that they received, reports that they received in 2018 was of self-generated content. So are we going to prosecute our young people for, generating that kind of material? A lot of young boys and men will end up watching this, not knowing that this is a crime, right? So again, we will end up prosecuting and pushing them into, completely sort of incarcerating them in the juvenile justice homes. So I think I completely resonate what Jeremy, Vishaka and Amitabh said, where prosecution is fine, but most importantly, there is a need for a commitment and investment in education and awareness, especially with young men and boys. In a country like India, where again, access to technology, I mean, boys have more access to technology, they have all sorts of wherewithal, no matter where they are, in terms of accessing, the internet. So probably the focus needs to be really like zeroing in on educational awareness rather than only going behind prosecution, because who are we going to prosecute, in this?
Thank you, Uma. I guess now since we were discussing the victims and platforms, I just wanted to know, well, so one of the sort of the reasons that again from the side that wants to end encryption is that platforms don't don't act responsibly. They don't seem liable. They are not accountable. So that's why we need this. This is the stick that will get them to act. So I just wanted to know, but as Vishaka pointed out, from a victim-centric perspective, yeah. So what should be the nature of accountability, that you would assign to a platform, that towards a victim? Like, what would be a victim-centric approach that a platform can adopt? Vishaka, would you like to take that?
Okay, I mean, I think honestly, okay, here's what I'm going to say. I'm going to say actually that a platform has to first realize that it's not accountable only to its shareholders, right? Which is kind of where we are getting stuck, right? Sort of the whole corporate framing of the big platforms. I think the second thing is that, it's not even just a victim-centric approach, to be honest. I think platforms are sort of so much part of our lives nowadays, right? All of us, that any of us can fall prey to a whole range of violations on these platforms, right? So I think the bigger question really is, what is the accountability that platforms have to users, right? Whose digital labor and whose digital data is anyway the key pathway for platform profitability, etc., right? Yeah. So I would locate that as the bigger sort of umbrella. And within that, there is no doubt that when it comes to vulnerable populations, etc., that perhaps the standard has to be even higher. But I think there's a very fundamental problem at this moment. And we see it with all the queer groups we work with, women with disabilities, like just everybody. People, even when they complain or report very anything on platforms, and we do workshops like literally teaching grassroots women in low income communities and girls, right? Like how to report. But the thing is, frankly, we're always asking ourselves, why are we even bothering to teach them this? Because there's no response, there's no transparency, there's no accountability. So it's kind of like it's really like a black hole at this point. And I think that is the problem. And I want to say, actually, we've seen this all along in the whole spectrum of violence. A lot of victims do not like going to the law, right? We see it very much in child sexual abuse cases. We also see it where people, face other forms of violence if there are other remedies. Often people, particularly in India, turn to the law as a last resort, not as a first resort. And therefore, so I think this is just like an unending sort of situation where platforms are just never doing enough. They're just not fundamentally taking responsibility.
Thank you, Vishaka. Jeremy, would you like to add here?
Sure. I think platforms can do a better job in at least 3 areas. Firstly, designing their products to be safer. For example, turning off defaults that allow their users to be contacted by strangers, especially if they're underage. That shouldn't be something that can happen by default. Secondly, they need to make it easier for victims to report abuse when it does happen. There should be just 1 or 2 clicks to report and block an abusive user, rather than having to search through help pages and so on. And thirdly, I think they can help users to get support for themselves or others who are at risk. A good example of that is just making helpline information available. And if the platform is able to access unencrypted metadata that suggests that the user is at risk, it can actually send them a targeted message to say, are you okay? Do you need help? And point them towards resources. And there are platforms that do that. For example, if a platform detects that a user might be having suicidal thoughts, they will sometimes pop up a message to a helpline. And we can do the same thing when there are signs that a user might be being groomed or being sexually harmed. So I think there's a lot more that they can do to make their platform safer for their users without having to go to the extent of removing encryption.
Shit.
Did we lose our moderator?
I think Siddharth is reconnecting just silence by giving my inputs. So completely
Yes.
agreeing to what Vishakadi you said, and Jeremy, you pretty much put the nail on the head. The solution is long term, and it is a very boring one. It goes back to where all of this begins. Sadly is education and awareness, and it sounds very boring, and many activists for thousands of years have said it, but unless we have sex education in this country, everything we are talking about is already too late. If the children have reached on a platform where parents are unaware, children are unaware, then safety is probably last of their concern. It's like driving on a highway without a driving license, in a car without seat belts and not even knowing in which direction you are going. So it's just about an accident. Safety by design, like you said, Jeremy, is already in talks, and we need to look into when the coders get to these fancy colleges, or even when the dream of a coding starts, is the dream of the ethics and safety going with it? Or is it that my VC only cares about scale, so I only create scale? But is the VC looking at the product with a safety lens? Like Vishaka Deen know much better about gender. You can't look at the gender lens at the end of forming your organization. It has to be the day the idea was conceptualized. Was it a gender-sensitive idea? Was it a idea sensitive for all sexualities, for people with different abilities? Similarly, was the idea safe? Because once we reach the scale of 1 billion users, then to get safety is impossible. Many of our large platforms are dealing with this problem. Similarly, are the VCs looking at safety of the product, or they are just concerned about how big it will get and when can I sell it. When an Uber was created, did we think about the rapes that can happen in that car, or were we not concerned? If we increase the accountability of the platform to the extent that if somebody is on your platform, it becomes your responsibility, like an insurance for the victim. It becomes your responsibility to ensure they are rehabilitated, that the perpetrator goes to jail. Put your fancy lawyers in making sure that that criminal is put in jail. Suddenly we'll see the flip in the scenario. So I think we can certainly increase the accountability on platforms a millionfold than where it is right now. It is hidden different words like startups, social media. These are businesses, and businesses need to be accountable for their customers. And be it an Indian or an American, anybody using the internet is not just a number or a user or a data package. That's a human we are talking about. And I think activist communities as well as the state has to get extremely bold with its voice. And every time we have discussed with various ministers, I always say, instead of changing laws for the users, why don't we look into changing laws for the businesses? Because they have the ability to bring about these change. I mean, at the end of the day, there are 3 or 4 companies running the internet. They are the ones which have maximum capital. And if they decide to change, we can see a major systemic change coming in this space.
Thank you, Amitabh and Jeremy, for dealing with the lack of a moderator. I'm so sorry, I got disconnected. Like it's Netflix time in my house. You know? Yeah. So Uma, like I would like to ask, like so now this is like the accountability of the platforms, but now other than again sticking with from a victim-centric perspective, right? Like in your work, you've definitely come to know that a victim needs much more than criminal justice, right? So what are those sort of what are those services that a victim of a child sexual abuse material would require? Do you think that's there in India right now?
So I think like you can't be treating a victim of child sexual abuse material different from a victim who has actually gone through, let's say, sexual violence in sort of the real life, right? So the medium is different, but the impact could be the same, right? So, and I think the approach for treating victims, number one, like what we need to do is we really need to scale up and invest in psychosocial sort of support. Rehabilitation is not a time-bound thing that happens for victims, and we can count the number of organizations that are working with victims through in-depth rehabilitation, because what is justice can be debatable, right? Prosecuting an online sexual abuse offender can be justice for whom is also debatable. But from a victim's point of view, I think number one, access to mental health services. Number two, like access to rehabilitation and psychosocial support where her or his life comes back to normal. The routine goes on. They are able to do everything that others in their group, other peer groups are able to achieve. I think that is important. In India, there are networks. So we have the Childline Network. We have organizations working with victims. But I really think there is a need for investment in capacity building. Forget online sexual abuse material. We don't even have enough capacities once we move beyond the metros to deal with sexual violence cases or POCSO cases of victims from marginalized communities. Too many dynamics there. So I think that kind of investment and that depth of support is needed. And Sid, if I could just jump in on one sort of thing for the previous question, I think apart from the things that were said, the moderation systems have to be stepped up. Like human context is extremely necessary when we are talking about accountability of platforms. Like you cannot tell me we have ramped up AI. If you're telling me that a self-driven automated car can navigate in Mumbai, then I would start believing in your AI systems. Like till then, don't tell me that. So making sure that your moderation systems are contextualized and the human context is available for victims, because for a victim of child sexual abuse material, that image, that material has to be out of the internet. That's the beginning of her healing or his healing. So that I think is very important.
Thank you, Uma. So we'll just take some questions that's coming in from the live stream. So someone has asked, victims do not like to go to the law because of so many reasons, and I think that has been sort of mentioned here on the talk as well. So what do you think then is the best redressal for them? Yeah, Amitabh?
I completely agree that that is the situation right now. But there are two aspects to that. Number one, we need to change that. We need to make the policing system of India a lot more sensitive and the law a lot more sensitive. It's a long route, but we cannot stop walking on it, because there are countries in the world where people do reach out to police and want and think police help them. So that solution needs to be about. Secondly, some Jeremy said, I'd like to come back to that. It takes to create an account on any platform, and sometimes even two, and sometimes it is automatically created. But when you want to get off a problem, it takes 300 clicks and 300 hours, and I have to call everybody on the planet in order to just register my complaint. So that fault in design has to be removed as well. If it takes one click to get on your platform, if I have a problem, it should take half a click from your side to solve my problem. We flip this around. There is absolutely no way that survivors of cyber violence and abuse will any day feel safer. Plus, we need to make sure that there is absolutely no space for debate where it is not considered as a soft problem or a soft crime, which I sometimes think that although on public platforms, many people talk about it as the biggest problem, but somebody working on the back ends, I don't really see the priority in it, neither budget-wise, nor manpower-wise, nor even deploying the best AI out there, because the best AI licenses are also extremely expensive, and it takes a lot of.
I would just like to sort of like come in, like just sort of build on what you said. Like, one of the experiences that we've had is that, now suppose something happens to a child online, right? And now this child is then protected by all the privacy mechanisms that the that the platform offers them, right? Like, either it can be a complete anonymity, right? But now if something happens and that person then has to report this crime, this person, this individual then has to sort of forego this privacy. Like he will have to come out with his complete identity and say that this happened to me. So I think how do we address that? How do we ensure that, because on a platform you're promised anonymity, but when you report it, especially to the authorities, the anonymity and confidentiality definitely takes a hit. So how do we ensure this continuation of privacy and anonymity? Like, if you have any thoughts on that, any one of our panelists, or is it necessary for the user to sort of forgo privacy?
Certainly, I mean, why is the onus on the survivor? Why the onus put on the survivor? There is a negative experience on the platform, in the society for that matter of fact. Why do I have to prove that I went through a negative experience, right? It feels like, okay, now give me all your data, give me your Aadhaar card, send me your passport, give me your DNA. The second I'm saying that, please help me. So as I'm saying that, unless you flip it around and put the onus on the platform, and the only way it is going to go on the platform is through financial, and very strong remunerations which are put on them in case they do something wrong.
So now, just to sort of keep away the sort of like framework of encryption and safety and privacy around it, and come to something very core, sort of like an issue, I think, which is what some of the parents are also asking on the question and answer thing. So what is the importance of online privacy for a child, or to frame it in another way, what is the importance of an unsurveilled space online for a child? So what, if you are move away from the framework of the debate and as a fundamental right, what are the how does the child benefit? And Vishakha, do you want to start with this?
Let me give this a moment. I need to think about this a little more, right? So if either of the others would like to pitch in. Yeah.
Jeremy?
Well, I think a good way to look at it is that battling child sexual abuse images is a way of protecting children's privacy. So the irony of using, infringing their privacy to battle child abuse images is that you're kind of giving privacy with one hand while taking it away with the other. Instead, we need to battle CSAM in a way that isn't based on infringing anyone's privacy, because when we weaken privacy protection, it hurts children as much as it hurts anyone else. And we don't want our children's information to be snooped on by criminals or by government or by companies. And we shouldn't have to agree to that just to protect them from sexual abuse. So a secure internet helps to protect both the privacy of their bodies, but also the privacy of their information. And I think we have to recognize that both are important. Child rights isn't just about child protection, it's child rights. They have a right to privacy, they have a right to freedom of expression, and these things are not incompatible with protecting them against abuse. I think we just have to recognize that we have to uphold all of their rights at the same time.
Can I come in now?
Yes, please.
Okay, sorted out my thoughts. Okay, super. So I totally agree with Jeremy, and I'm going to try and approach it from a slightly sort of sideways perspective, because I think we really need to think about who do we see in our heads when we say child, right? And I think this is a very perplexing situation, because the age of consent in India, for example, is 18, right? We know that particularly when we think about it from the perspective, again, of like, say, a 12-year-old or a 13-year-old, right? That is the age for sure when sexual exploration begins. And we know that, you know, like even in cultures like menstruation is seen as a point at which people move away from sort of technically being one kind of child, let's say, right? Yeah. So for me, honestly, I think it's really important to sort of unpack childhood. So while completely agreeing, you know, and sort of think of like a progressive realization or an arc. For example, when we do sex education, we think about age-appropriate sex education, right? So the information we give somebody who's, say, 6 years old or 7 years old may not be the same information that we give someone who's 17 years old, even though we may say that, you know, this is something that both of them need to, information that both of them need. I really think that we need to start thinking about, like, you know, building privacy messages which are more sort of in age slabs. And I think we really need to think about the link with sexuality, because I would argue very strongly that when you're a teenager, even though you're a child as per the law, you're actually at a very different space in your own life. And you need a certain kind of privacy to be able to like explore desire, intimacy, love, sex, romance, none of which are crimes, frankly, regardless of what the law says, right? And so we need some sort of way by which, at the same time, for someone who's below 18, they can explore these consensually without being considered criminals. And also sort of have, you know, so you need privacy in order to be able to do this, right? But if you're always going to have sort of this overwhelming sort of sense that, you know, children who get onto the internet or teenagers who get onto the internet are like running amok and are like, you know, endangering themselves continuously, etc., then you completely go away from the rights model to a protection model that I do not believe is fruitful in the short, medium, or long term. So I'd really like to suggest that we think about, you know, like messaging, like, okay, 6-year-old, what does a 6-year-old need to know about privacy? What is a 10-year-old? What is a 14? And some of it's common, but some of it does change.
Thank you, Vishaka. Uma, can you just sort of comment on this question? And there are a lot of like parents I can see on the public chat, and they are sort of asking if they need to monitor their children more, if they're spending more time online. So if you can sort of wrap in my question and the questions of these parents together, you know, from a parenting point of view, that would be great.
Okay, so I think in terms of privacy, like number one, as a country, as a society, we don't consider it as a right for our children, right? We are supposed, I mean, children don't have privacy. That's our basic assumption. Like, what is privacy? Sometimes we don't even consider privacy for adults. So I think number one, like somewhere there has to be a fundamental shift in where parents are thinking, where they need to understand that there are times when children want to probably look within themselves and they don't want anyone else to look with them, you know, and it happens all the time. Like, it could happen with a young toddler who is role playing, who doesn't want to be, you know, surveilled, or doesn't want a mother to be listening to what this child is trying to say, right? And somewhere, like, it directly affects the self-esteem of the child when you put in all these mechanisms of surveillance. It could affect their imagination, like Vishakha said, it could affect their, you know, their freedom of expression, their exploration, all of that, right? Like, so I think online privacy is extremely important. Like, it's one of the key components to raising a child who has, you know, a sense of who or she is, or building that sense of who or she is. And the second thing, in terms of should I monitor or should I not? Like, I mean, that is a question I throw to parents and say, would you like to be monitored on the internet? Like, if I were to grab your phone right now and suddenly go through all, you know, would it be an effect? Would it have an impact on your dignity? The answer is probably yes. And if the answer is yes, then I think the same rule applies to your children, because, I mean, what you don't do with yourself, you don't do it with your children, right? So I think somewhere we'll have to draw a line in terms of, there are certain things that we are not comfortable talking about. We have not been spoken about. You know, we don't talk about pornography in our families. We don't talk about self-generated, you know, nude imagery in our family. That does not mean our children are not going to engage in this. So somewhere I think it's more of an education that's needed for parents. And there are ample of resources out there. Like, if you're a parent who's extremely worried, but who's also really committed to giving your child that complete experience on the internet, I would urge you really to educate yourself and probably get comfortable in your own skin with your own sexuality, your myths about pornography, stuff like that, and have an open conversation with your child. Like, you'll be amazed how children can be responsible users of the internet as well.
Thank you, Uma. And Amitabh, so if your parents want to sort of monitor your phone, what would you tell them?
Oh, please go ahead and answer all my emails. Although that wasn't the answer when I was younger. But two aspects that I'd like to quickly raise. See, safety and privacy are not a user definition. Right now, we go by a definition which has been created in the West. Because what is the signet is a very important question. In India, family sometimes is considered as a single unit, and many parents are very indulged in their child's life. So while go with the ideal definition, we cannot forget the reality of Indian families and the reality of Indian parents. It would have a storage, but parents out there, parenting is a whole new space. We do a lot of work in it, and I completely echo what Uma said about this, that sadly a space where role will not work as much as conversation will work, as much as transparency will work, as much as sharing and co-learning will work, because she will understand better than you, and that is just the reality of this. So my is shouting that I have to get on to another extremely double. So on that last moment, thank you for having me, but I would have to sadly jump off now. So thank you much, and parents, please out parenting, because it's the major solution for all of us.
Yeah, don't worry, we'll always find out where you are. Thank you so much, Amitabh, for being with us. And I think we are sort of like moving into like the last question, and then if we have time, we'll take some more audience questions.
Sorry to interrupt. Before you go there, can I just drop one example about privacy during the lockdown, which I think really illustrates the problem. So we've been talking with a number of queer groups, and a number of teenagers who are queer are not out to their parents, right, or to their families. But because we're all stuck in lockdown and we're sitting at home all the time, sometimes there's been situations, like we know a couple of cases where, you know, parents have sort of like looked at the young person's phone and then inadvertently people who are queer have been outed to their families, right? And this has caused severe problems for them because their families, their parents haven't accepted their sexual identity or their orientation. And so now they're in this terrible space where they're stuck in the house. They have no privacy whatsoever. And actually the being inadvertently outed and their privacy being violated is now leading to further violations by family members against them, right? So just to illustrate that, again, not all families are the same, not all parents are the same, not all children are the same. And there are many, many young people who we work with who face terrible stigma and discrimination from their families, and they really need privacy big time.
Thank you, Vishakha. And I think we'll move on to the last question. So, which is like your laundry list of wishes of, of positive changes that can happen in this scenario. So, what systems, responses, changes do you envision, when responding to CSAM that can sort of safeguard both privacy and safety of children? Like if there were a couple of things that you would recommend, what would those things be? Jeremy?
Well, I'd like to echo what Vishakha said about stigma being a problem and the need to take shame away from the victims, so that if they do find themselves in a position where they're possibly being abused and not recognizing it, they can come forward, they can feel confident in coming forward to parents or other trusted adults to talk about it. And as I think I said before, comprehensive sex education is one component of a solution. And that fits into the primary prevention section of the prevention pyramid that I was talking about. It targets the whole community so that everyone knows, what is normal, what is not normal. And we need to make it easier for people who are worried either about being a victim or even about being a perpetrator, that they are able to access support before it goes down that path. So I think the systems to respond need to be based on prevention. And if the worst does happen and someone does offend, then we need to not just look at punishment as an objective of the criminal justice system, but also rehabilitation to make sure that someone who is offended, eventually they're going to be back in the community again. And we don't want them to offend again once they are reintegrated into society. So really just taking a holistic approach to this that isn't based around just one thing, and the fundamentals of prevention based on the reduction of stigma, open communication, listening to our children, not trying to control them too tightly because they'll just rebel against that. Instead, making sure that they have the trust to be able to speak with someone if they're in trouble.
Thank you, Jeremy. Vishakha?
Frankly, I agree 100% with everything that Jeremy said and, fully endorse. This is what I would have said. And one last thing is, also to leave it up to the, what is the child's sense of justice, or what is the one thing that the child needs that will enable them to become to heal from child sexual abuse. I think that's really important because not everybody is looking for the law to lead them towards justice. So I think again, really, putting that person at the center, right? And saying for some people, it's just really important to be supported, to be counseled, to feel whole again, right? So let's not again make a hierarchy and assume that prosecution or legal justice is a higher form of justice than healing justice, right? Or than the child feeling whole again and recovering and really going on to lead full lives.
Thank you, Vishakha. And Uma, would you like to come in here?
I think I agree with everything that it said. The only thing I would like to add is just before response, I think reporting of CSAM in India, I mean, we need a better system. So currently we do have the cybercrime portal, but if you try and report there, there is absolutely no anonymity. It's like, again, like a black box, right? Like it goes, there's no opacity. You cannot do anonymous reporting. A cop will call you saying, where did you see this image? So somewhere the first step is really to make sure that we have a functioning sort of a system that functions and it's responsive to the needs of people who are reporting. That is going to encourage more reporting and making sure that, you know, we're taking this down, etc. So I think the other is sort of the other parts are really covered by my co-panelists, but this is something I would really sort of emphasize on.
Thank you. One question from what the audience is asking. A lot of questions are sort of around, like, do we need to nudge children to show them what content is right or wrong? Like, do children need nudge? Like, how do we develop this sort of this is good or this is bad? And I think, like, if like our panelists can sort of just shine a light on, like, like what is the approach to take here? Like, do children need to be nudged, or what will happen if you nudge them? And is this the right approach? Any, anyone can just sort of.
Well, one thing that can be done is to establish a household rule that children don't use their devices in the bathroom or in the bedroom. They have to use them in public parts of the house. And that might be a sensible rule for a household to negotiate if the parents are worried. But I think peering over the child's shoulder is not the right approach, and it's not going to engender trust with the child. So I think a balance has to be struck.
Yeah, Sid. Sorry.
Please.
Yeah, I would also say, like, it's good to sort of have a conversation and really understand what children are looking at. You know, what is it that interests them? Because sometimes I think what is right and what is not right can also keep shifting, right? So somewhere it's also important to look at content which is currently being consumed by our children. And if you're really nudging them in a particular direction, I think the rationale has to be pretty strong as to why this and why not this. Otherwise they're not going to listen to you.
Listen, I'm sorry, but I have to jump off now. So just wanted to thank everybody for a wonderful session. Learned a lot, and catch you all again.
Okay. Yeah, bye, Vishaka. Thank you so much for being here. And I think, like, with that, we also come to an end to this session. Thank you all our panelists. Thank you, Jeremy, and for late, and thank you for accommodating us. Just to sort of like quickly sum up, I think, like, a lot of, like, what our panelists said, they put the child at the center of it and looked at it from, like, in the best interest of the child. They were looking at, like, solutions that were culturally specific, that, not just sort of like law enforcement specific. There was a lot of talk of capacity building of the systems in a victim-centric manner to sort of, like, support. There was like a need. I think one of the sort of, I think the lasting thing that I will take away from this is the need to look at CSAM as a public health issue. And it's not like a simple problem, it's a complex problem. And, like, like any complex problem, it needs a layered approach. And I think one of the strongest sort of sentiments made today against, like, simple prosecution and, like, following down that path of, like, let's put the bad people inside is, like, sometimes, like, images are self-generated, sometimes children are experimenting, and sometimes like there is no way for, like, human, let alone an AI, to decide, like, like, is this like CSAM or is it not, or is this, like, is this a bad image, is this a crime or is it not? It's a much more complex scenario, they vary. So I think there is a need to look at this issue in all its complexity. Thank you so much, everybody, for participating. Thank you for, like, the questions. Once again, like, just if you want to know more about Jeremy, visit asia.org. You can see all the wonderful work that he does. If you want to check out the work done by Point of View, which is Vishaka's NGO, you can go to pointofview.org. Amitabh's work is available on social media, socialmediamatters.in. Aram's work is available at aramvidya.org. That's a double A. And IFF's work is available at internetfreedom.in. If you're there, please don't forget to donate so that they can continue sort of doing like this. A big shout out to Shivani, who she mentioned that this was the toughest group she put together. So, and I know that she was working weekends. So thank you so much, Shivani, for putting this together. We like this is just the beginning, and we'll starting to take this ahead. So good night and thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Sid. Bye, Jeremy. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye bye.